So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Bell Hooks' essay, Understanding Patriarchy. We have already had two lectures on this essay, and we stopped at a very interesting and unsettling point, the last lecture, where a female child was beaten and abused by the big daddy, the big patriarchal figure, for not being obedient enough to the patriarchal principles. And Hooks mentions the trauma, the suffering, the violence, the pornography of patriarchal violence, which was unleashed on her at that particular point of time, and how that was a very moving experience for her, emotionally unsettling experience for her, existentially unsettling experience for her. And of course, the fact of physical beating was painful enough. And what's also interesting is how the mother comes to the child at the end of that particular session, where she's banished in a room, in a dark room, isolated, alienated for not being a conformist, and how the mother comes to the female child and explains to her that it's actually her fault, that she wanted to do things which a girl ought not to do, just because she happens to be a girl, and how girls can't do the same thing as boys do. And if they want to do those things, they are punished, they are reprimanded, and they are punitive measures may be taken against them. And this particular episode of the big daddy beating the female child for not being a conformist becomes the punitive measure, becomes punishment for the disobedient, deviant child. Okay, so we move on with the essay in this particular lecture, and we talk about how similar situations have psychological effects, and how this particular experience it created a deep-seated traumatic effect on the girl child's mind. And she says, I remember this traumatic event so well because it was a story told again and again within our family. No one cared that a constant retelling might trigger post-traumatic stress. The retelling was necessary to reinforce both the message and the remembered state of absolute powerlessness. So this is a very key component of grand narratives, of stereotypes, as we see, as you've seen already when we read Bhava and Fanon and Orwell. It has to be repeated all the time. It has to be repeated ad infinitum, just to reinforce the point, just to consolidate the point, just so everyone gets to know the replications, the retributions for not being an obedient girl child. If you're not an obedient girl child, you'll be punished, you'll be violently punished, you'll be beaten, you'll be abused, and that's perfectly fine, because that's what happens to disobedient children. And this particular episode becomes a very interesting reminder of that kind of punishment, that kind of a punitive measure taken against a disobedient female child. The punitive measure obviously being carried out by the patriarchal agent, by the patriarchal figure, the big daddy in question. So the recollection of this brutal whipping of the little girl daughter by a big strong man served as more than just a reminder to everyone watching, remembering, to all my siblings, male and female, and to our grown woman, mother, that our patriarchal father was ruler in our household. We were to remember that if we did not obey his rules, we would be punished even unto death. This is the way we were experientially schooled in the art of patriarchy. So this is a point that I've been sort of suggesting from the very beginning of this particular essay. The experientiality of patriarchy is not just a discursive phenomenon. It's not just a textbook which needs to be obeyed, it's experience which needs to be obeyed, and the experience of being punished if you don't obey it, the physical experience, the violence, the abuse that you get as a female child if you do not obey patriarchy, if you do not conform to patriarchy. And this punishment is spectacular. This punishment happens as a public spectacle, almost a public spectacle, in front of everyone, with everyone being complicit in different degrees to the punishment. The perpetrator is a big daddy, but the mother too is a complicit agent to this entire session. She comes and tells the daughter later on that this had to happen because you're not being a good daughter, you're not being an obedient daughter. So the big daddy did the right thing by beating you, by abusing you. So let this be a lesson for you. So this particular experience was retold, was repeated over and over again, just to hammer home the point, the hegemony of the big daddy being a monstrous figure, the big daddy not just being a monstrous figure. I mean, he was monstrous in this particular episode, but he is a grand patriarch who overrules and who controls and who reinforces all kinds of rituals. So his word is law. Now, the question is, you can replace Big Daddy with government, you can replace Big Daddy with nation, you can replace Big Daddy with religion, and you'll get the same principle, you get the same structure, right? So it has a structural quality to it. The whole point of being repeated, a whole point of being subjugated, a whole point of being subordinated, if you do not obey the patriarchal principle, becomes the really key issue over here. So the big daddy becomes a symbolic function over here, a symbolic signifier of patriarchy. Patriarchy which will punish you if you do not obey its rules. Patriarchy which will pornographically punish you and abuse you and beat you and assault you, sometimes to the point of death, if you do not obey the principles that it lays out before you, especially as a female child. Okay, so we were experientially schooled in the art of patriarchy. So this indoctrination is a very, very experiential in quality, and this experientiality is a very important term over here. So again, we're looking at a mingling between discursivity and experientiality, the experience of being beaten, the experience of being abused, the experience of being assaulted by the big daddy, by the patriarchal figure for not being obedient enough. That becomes a very key component in this particular session. Okay, so there's nothing unique or even exceptional about this experience. So Hook says quite clearly that it may have been a traumatic experience for me, but there's nothing unique about it at all. There's nothing exceptional about it at all, because it happens all the time. It's something which we suffer all the time as female children. Listen to the voices of wounded, grown children raised in patriarchal homes, and you will hear different versions with the same underlying theme. The use of violence to reinforce our indoctrination and acceptance of patriarchy. So violence becomes a very effective instrument to consolidate, to reinforce patriarchy. So if you disobey patriarchy, if you move away from patriarchy, then violence becomes the de facto, the default mechanism of control, of coercion. And how can I get through to you? The female therapist Terence Real, a very, very important book, How Can I Get Through to You, is about a therapy writer, family therapy, sorry. The family therapist Terence Real tells how his sons were initiated into patriarchal thinking, even as the parents worked to create a loving home in which anti-patriarchal values prevailed. He tells of how his young son Alexander enjoyed dressing as Bobby until boys playing with his elder brother witnessed his Bobby persona and let him know by the gaze and the shocked, disapproving silence that his behavior was unacceptable. So again, look at something so seemingly innocuous as a Barbie doll, which is traditionally a female toy. Now, what if a boy plays with it? What if a little boy finds the Barbie more interesting and more engaging than a toy machine gun, than a toy marble? And that becomes a problem, because then you're subjected to a gaze which is judgmental, which is judging you as inefficient, inadequate, etc. And that becomes a very deep problem, even in households which make an attempt to be anti-patriarchal. So Terence Real says away, he tried to create a household for his children which is anti-patriarchal, which will bring them up in a way which is not traditionally patriarchal. But even so, he realized that there is this discourse of patriarchy all around you, in school, in playgrounds, in offices, in cafes, and everywhere. People are judging you if you're failing to live up to the patriarchal principles. If as a boy child, you're engaged, you're obsessed with Barbie dolls, then the other boys around you of your age, your peers, they will look down on you, look down upon you, and then you are judged, you are measured as being inefficient, and that becomes traumatic in some sense. So without a shred of malevolence, the stare my son received transmitted a message. So it did not be malevolent, it did not be evil, it did not be directly harmful, but it will still have a message, it will still convey a message. You are not to do this. And the medium that the message was broadcast in was a potent emotion, shame. So shame becomes a very potent emotion. So if you're made to feel ashamed of what you are, if you're made to feel ashamed for inadequacy as a person, as a masculine person, then that becomes a problem, and then that becomes a very key instrument for subjugation. At 3, Alexander was learning the rules. A 10-second wordless transaction was powerful enough to dissuade my son from that instant forward from what had been a favorite activity. I called such moments of induction the normal traumatization of boys. So look at the phrase which is used over here, normal traumatization. So it sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, but that's exactly what it is. It is a traumatization, but it's so normalized, it's so seemingly non-evil, so seemingly non-violent, that becomes almost a passive thing, but it's still an experience of trauma, because you have been judged as inefficient, as inadequate, as someone who is not living up to the patriarchal principles, not living up to the codes of patriarchal behavior. So a 10-second wordless transaction, it doesn't have to have any word, it doesn't have to have any language, it just needs to have a transaction, it just needs to have a gaze, it just needs to have a measuring gaze through which the entire transaction, through which the entire persona, the entire person, the subject is judged to be ineffective and ineffectual. Okay, to indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. This is a point in the essay which offers a really complex understanding of patriarchy in terms of how patriarchy, becomes mode of torture, not just for girls but also for boys. So we just saw how girls suffer abuse under patriarchy, how girls are beaten up, how girls are subjected to violence by big daddies, by the grand patriarchs. But also we see how boys often lose their agency, they often lose their free will in terms of conforming to patriarchy, in terms of this compulsion to conform to patriarchy and patriarchal principles. So that becomes a problem, and Hooks is very, very quick to highlight the problem. So my stories took place in the 50s. That was the 1950s that she refers to, and her own setting was different. The stories Real tells are recent. So Terence Real, who was a family therapist writing this particular book, the case studies that Terence Real offers are recent, contemporary experiences. They all underscore the tyranny of patriarchal thinking, the power of patriarchal culture to hold us captive. Real is one of the most enlightened thinkers on the subject of patriarchal masculinity in our nation, and yet he lets readers know that he's not able to keep his boys out of patriarchy's reach. So patriarchy, like capitalism, like religion, it has a bit of a ubiquitous presence. It has almost an omniscient, omnipresent quality. So you can make an attempt, you can make an effort to have a zone which is patriarchy-free zone, but it'll quickly come and consume you in a different form, in a different strategy, in a different kind of a subterfuge in some sense. So even if you attempt, even if you try to keep the children out of patriarchy's reach, patriarchy will find the children in some form and will affect them in some form. So he's not able to keep the boys out of patriarchy's reach. They suffer its assaults, as do all boys and girls to a greater or lesser degree. No doubt by creating a loving home that is not patriarchal, Real at least offers his boys a choice. They can choose to be themselves, or they can choose conformity with patriarchal rules. Real uses the term the phrase psychological patriarchy to describe the patriarchal thinking common to females and males. Despite the contemporary visionary feminist thinking that makes clear that a patriarchal thinker need not be a male, most folks continue to see men as a problem of patriarchy. This is simply not the case. Women can be as wedded to patriarchal thinking and actions as men. So this is the point in the essay where it really begins to become sort of post-structuralist and complex, and so it doesn't really matter if you're biologically a woman or biologically a male. You can be equally patriarchal in all respects. So the term psychological patriarchy that is offered away by Terence Real, who's a family therapist, is obviously an example of the indoctrination, the psychological indoctrination, the subconscious indoctrination that takes place often without any violence. So it can be violent, it can be abused, it can be direct, it can be visceral, but at the same time it can also be done in a more sophisticated way, a more sinister way. We don't have to be violent, it just gets the work done that way. So women and men can be equally complicit to patriarchy, can be equally wedded to patriarchal thinking and action. And that's the point that that Bell Hooks makes quite clearly at this stage in the essay. Okay, so now she moves on to another example, another person, another figure in this particular examination. Psychotherapist John Bradshaw's clear-sighted definition of patriarchy in Creating Love as a useful one. So he uses John Bradshaw, who's a psychotherapist, his definition of patriarchy in a book called Creating Love, and this is a definition that Hooks finds interesting. And what is the definition? The dictionary defines patriarchy as a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family in both domestic and religious functions. Patriarchy is characterized by male domination and power. He states that, further, the patriarchal rules still govern most of the world's religious, school systems, and family systems. Describing the most damaging of these rules, Bradshaw lists blind obedience, the foundation upon which patriarchy stands, the repression of all emotions except fear, the destruction of individual willpower, and the repression of thinking whenever it departs from the authority figure's way of thinking. Patriarchal thinking shapes the values of a culture. We are socialized into the system, females as well as males. Most of us learned patriarchal attitudes in our family of origin, and they were usually taught to us by our mothers. These attitudes were reinforced in schools and religious institutions. So the whole idea of patriarchy becomes is an organization, a social organization, which obviously becomes an indoctrination. It becomes a message, sometimes a moral message, sometimes there's a virtue made out of it. And the whole idea is to have the father figure as a head. Previously, it used to be a clan when in ancient systems, when ancient evolutionary systems where human beings flocked together as groups. There was one grand patriarch in a clan whose rule was the law, who was the strongest male, and that same kind of structure is replicated in different other systems such as schools, families, modern families, religious institutions and religious functions, etc. So it is about male domination and power. Now, these patriarchal rules govern the world's religious, school systems, or family systems. So in every system of organization, every system of human interaction, more often than not, there happens to be a grand patriarch who controls, whose word is the law, and who sets out the rules and ideologies which are followed and conformed to by the other subjects in question. Now, Bradshaw lists blind obedience, the foundation upon which patriarchy stands, the repression of all emotions except fear, the destruction of individual willpower, and the repression of thinking whatever it departs from authority figures' ways of thinking. So what is blind obedience? So blind obedience is any kind of repression of all emotions except fear. So you can only have fear, but everything else becomes repressed. It destroys individual thinking, and repression of thinking whenever it deviates from authority figures' will. So the authority figure sets out the will, sets out the logic, sets out the hegemonic thought system, which must be conformed to. If you move away from it, then that becomes a problem, and you repress that attitude, you repress that tendency to move away from it, and that informs blind obedience. So these are qualities of blind obedience that Bradshaw highlights, and that Bell Hooks finds interesting. So patriarchal thinking shapes the values of our culture. We are socialized into the system, females as well as males. Most of us learned patriarchal attitudes in our family of origin, and they were usually taught to us by our mothers. These attitudes were reinforced in schools and religious institutions. So again, we see how mothers become important in this patriarchal legacy. So the mothers are the people who teach children, male children as well as female children, the patriarchal principles, which are then consolidated in schools, colleges, institutions, religious institutions, etc. Okay. So the contemporary presence of female-headed households has led many people to assume that children in those households are not learning patriarchal values because no male is present. So again, what Hooks is trying to offer over here is just moving away from this very blunt binary of males being patriarchal and women being rebellious and non-patriarchal. So she says there are many instances today where entire households are run by women, single moms, mothers who earn the living, and whether the father is absent, either dead or absent. And one would expect, there is an expectation, general expectation of these households of children who turn out to be less patriarchal than other heteronormative households. But that's more often than not the case, where we find these children, these households can end up being as patriarchal, perhaps more patriarchal than households which do have a father figure, right? So that is a problem that Hooks is highlighting over here. So it's not an easy equation that way. And Hooks moves away from any kind of an easy equation in terms of looking at patriarchy and non-patriarchy. Okay, so they assume that men are the sole teachers of patriarchal thinking. Yet, many female-headed households endorse and promote patriarchal thinking with far greater passion than two-parent households. So sometimes we find that single-parent households, female-parent households, they end up becoming more passionately patriarchal than two-parent households, and that's often the case, as Hooks points out, because they do not have an experiential reality to challenge false fantasies of gender roles. Women in such households are far more likely to idealize the patriarchal male role and patriarchal men than women who live with patriarchal men every day. Now, because these women do not actually live with the patriarchal men, they have this false fantasy about patriarchy, which they can't move away from, which they can't refute, because there's no real men. And when you don't have a real man, then the entire false fantasy becomes a very successful fantasy, because you don't know how to refute it. Now, if you have a real man, then you can confront the real man in different micro confrontations. you can confront the patriarchal principles in certain micro degrees, and in that process you can make an attempt, you can engage at least at some level to refute and engage and to deconstruct patriarchal motives. Whereas if you don't have any father figure at all you have is a false fantasy of patriarchy that you don't quite know how to refute, because there is no father figure, there is no real men, a real male present over there. So those households often end up becoming more fantastically patriarchal. And I use the word fantastic quite literally. I mean, patriarchy becomes a fantasy which is adhered to, which is conformed to in those households, simply because of lack of engagement within real men. So that becomes a more fantastically patriarchal setting, as Hooks points out. So we need to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture, so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally. So patriarchy is not some kind of a male logic alone. Patriarchy is a system, an epistemological system, a cultural system, a functional system, a legal system that is conformed to, that is upheld by men as well as women, and not just owned by men. Even if men receive more rewards from that system, dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. So that's a very important lesson, it's a very important message that Hooks is trying to promote, trying to convey in this particular section, where she says that dismantling patriarchy must be a collaborative effort. It must not be a confrontational effort. It must not be a confrontation with men and women. It should not be men versus women. It should not be men who are bad and women who are victims. That's a very blunt binary of looking at a patriarchal system. The patriarchal system requires complicit participants who are men as well as women. So in order to dismantle patriarchy, it's equally important to have a more collaborative and more dialogic approach between men and women if we are to do a serious dismantling, if we were to do a serious deconstruction of patriarchy as a system. So I'll stop at this point today, but the point that Hooks is trying to make here is we need to move away from the binary of men versus women, which sometimes, some orders of feminism, some brands of feminism get caught up in that kind of a binary, and Hooks is obviously opposing the binary. She's trying to move away from the binary and look at a more collaborative, a more holistic, a more complex approach to patriarchy, which then will become a very key instrument, mechanism, if you will, to dismantle and understand and deconstruct patriarchy in some form or the other. So I'll stop at this point. I will continue with this text in the following lectures. Thank you for your attention.